Just as I was wrapping up my script for this video, PewDiePie dropped this video titled Training Like Mishima for 7 Days. In this video, he follows the workout regimen of Yukio Mishima, the Japanese author, poet, and far-right ultra-nationalist terrorist. But don't worry y'all, because in the beginning of the video, he says this.
I adore Mishima's novels, this is no secret, but the author is controversial, so I just want to be clear. I want to discuss the book, and that's it.
Now, this wording bothered me. Calling Yukio Mishima simply controversial is a bit reductive considering the fact that he was a far-right Japanese ultra-nationalist who attempted a coup d'etat. Now, I could make a whole video on Felix's reactionary politics. I mean, my Desi brothers and sisters know firsthand the impact that he's had on racism against South Asians online and in person, not to mention his many flirtations with right-wing figures and ideas. But before the Felix fanboys rush to my comment section with a monologue on how PewDiePie is just following his workout routine, not promoting a political ideology, I want you guys to hear me out. Now, this isn't the first time that PewDiePie has spoken highly of Mishima, but I found this video of his to be particularly unsettling because it advertises itself as a wellness video.
Mishima thought pain was valuable because it reveals our vulnerabilities and weaknesses. We can also transform through pain. Mentally and physically, we become stronger. And if we choose the opposite, which is comfort, it would instead lead to mediocrity and stagnation.
However, Mishima's philosophy on the body is not wellness-oriented at all. In reality, his words are those of an alienated individual who became consumed with the aesthetics of Japanese fascism. Now, I understand that sometimes you gotta separate the art from the artist, but art can also serve a propagandist function. For example, Mishima's literature on the body is inseparable from his fascistic politics. And while it may seem silly, influencers do play a role in shaping the political consciousness of the youth. And trust me, PewDiePie is aware of his young and impressionable audience, so pushing this kind of rhetoric is quite dangerous. In this video, we are going to go a little deeper and explore what I like to call the body cult of fascism. We will explore its relationship to hypermasculinity, aesthetics, and analyze how it manifests itself throughout history. Fascist propaganda has many components, and it can manifest in several different ways, from philosophy and literature to fashion and consumerism. For this video, we are going to explore how fascism uses the masculine body as a template for the nationalist state, empowering its citizens to strengthen their race in order to conquer others.
ために死ぬっていうことが人間の最も華々しいあるいは英雄的なあるいは立派な死に方だというふうに考えられている。
But before we get into this video, I did have to re-record like 3 times because of the heat has been unbearable and I'm recording in my attic. So it would be great if you guys could subscribe. And if you want to support my content further, I do have a Patreon. I will link it down in the description. Now enjoy the video.
At San Francisco, they found a tribe of strong, silent, and almost perfect men. So give them a hand, girls.
But what is fascism? Well, there isn't a coherent set of beliefs that define this ideology. Its manifestations and history share a similar opportunistic tendency. You see, fascists espouse a populist and nationalist ideology that appeals to a wide range of people in order to solve the problems of society by increasing their grip on state control and violence. Unfortunately, fascism has been oversimplified in popular history. We learn about the terror of the great tyrants without learning about their appeal to the masses. But history isn't created by individuals, by great tyrants and dictators. It's created by the masses, the government, corporations, and so much more. In studying fascism, we must go beyond this great man theory and analyze how the state was able to mobilize people into committing some of the gravest atrocities known to man. Like I say in all my videos, we are no better than the people of the past, and we are equally as capable of giving power to fascism. So we must analyze what draws people into these movements in the first place. Since the political programs of fascism are inherently oppressive and work against the will of the masses, the state has to create a romantic narrative in the propaganda that they produce. Now let's think about it for a second. How would you convince the masses that your cause is right and just if it is anything but that? To answer that question, let me ask you this. What do humans value that transcend morality? Beauty. Beauty can invoke intense, passionate feelings that can override any moral judgment of a person's character. You're more likely to value something if it has an aesthetic quality to it. The word aesthetic is derived from the Greek word aesthetikos, which translates to sense perception, but it was later redefined as a sensation of beauty by Alexander Baumgarten. He argued that our tastes in art are indicative of an ability to judge according to the senses instead of according to our intellect. To him, we can determine that a work of art is beautiful not because of the way it's painted, but rather by the sensations and feelings that are evoked when we look at said work of art. Art has many mediums, from traditional fine art to bodybuilding. For the purpose of this video, we are going to define art as something that involves craftsmanship. Historically, movements have used aesthetics to push their political narratives. As Walter Benjamin states, quote,
"The growing proletarianization of modern man and the increasing formation of masses are two aspects of the same process. Fascism attempts to organize the newly created proletarian masses without affecting the property structure which the masses strive to eliminate. Fascism sees its salvation in giving these masses not their right, but instead a chance to express themselves. The masses have a right to change property relations. Fascism seeks to give them an expression while preserving property. The logical result of fascism is the introduction of aesthetics into political life."
In sum, oppressive governments offer their citizens the right to express their grievances instead of the right to create a coherent political program. Grievances without a program allow the fascist regime to maintain their control over the government. The state encourages unified resentment, displays of anger, and physical spectacles, and thus channels them into their propaganda. In the hands of reactionaries, the discontent of the masses is encouraged, twisted, and then channeled into a scapegoat that maintains the authority of the ruling class. They claim that it's not capitalist exploitation that's hindering the German people, it's the Jews. It's not the working class that's at risk, but it's the white race. The state uses art to legitimize and empower these narratives because aesthetic expressions mask the material problems of the state. It can speak to your heart and cloud your judgment. There's a reason that the Nazis fueled so much money into architecture, military parades, and encouraged the revival of classical art. Beauty can evoke feelings of authority and power, and the fascist state has to portray themselves as the dominating force in order to justify their conquest. If any of you have ever been inside of a cathedral, I'm sure you know the intense feelings evoked when you first stepped inside of one. The sheer size of the building humbles you, makes you feel small in the face of the church. It has this weird ability to make you feel both scared and comforted at the same time. And this is intentional, to give authority to the church. Now, I'm not saying that the church is a fascist institution, but I'm saying that beauty has the power to uphold unequal power relations and can evoke a sense of authority even with regimes that are deemed exploitative.
War is beautiful because it establishes man's dominion over the subjugated machinery by means of gas masks, terrifying megaphones, flamethrowers, and small tanks. War is beautiful because it initiates the dreamt of metalization of the human body. War is beautiful because it enriches a flowering meadow with the fiery orchids of machine guns. War is beautiful because it combines the gunfire, the cannonades, the ceasefire, the scents, and the stench of putrefaction into a symphony.
This quote is taken from Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, the Italian futurist, theorist, and poet. Futurism was a political philosophy that gained prominence in 1910s Italy. It espoused progress, the development of technology, and rapid change. To attain this new futurist utopia, Marinetti promoted an aesthetic notion of violence and masculine domination. In his manifesto on futurism, he romanticizes war, portraying militarism and expansionism as a violent but beautifully righteous act. The violence glorified in this act is violence against people who rebelled against the oppressive state, or those who were seen as racially inferior. Futurist art promoted the idea that mankind had to eliminate these threats through warfare and physical strength. I don't think it'll surprise many of you to know that Marinetti was one of the first affiliates of the Italian Fascist Party. Now that we have a little bit of background, let's take a closer look at his quotation. Specifically, let's examine the line where he states that war is beautiful because it initiates the dreamt-of metalization of the human body. This metalization of the human body perfectly encapsulates the fascist obsession with aesthetics, masculinity, domination, and physical fitness. This is a term that has reverberated in fascistic literature and popular culture throughout history, and still holds relevance in online alt-right spaces today. The masculine idea of the domineering, metallized body is used in the state in propaganda as a means of ideologically mobilizing their male population into war and committing their physical bodies to the state. The futurists sought to metallize the flesh, to fuse man with the machine, ridding man of their allegedly feminine aspects. According to Christine Poggi, Marinetti believed that it was precisely because nature is understood as the locus of the feminine and the maternal that it must be opposed and displaced by both the machine and its symbolic ally, matter. To Marinetti, nature could not propel mankind forward like metal could. Nature was weak, feminine, and in need of domination by steel. Around the time in which he wrote his manifesto, Marinetti also wrote his novel Marfaka the Futurist, in which the protagonist Marfaka creates one of history's earliest examples of the cyborg. Poggi states that the cyborg, quote,
With his coarse skin, square jaw, ribs of iron, and formidable metallic member, Marfarka finds his creation beautiful.
The male genitalia being metallic is significant because, once again, metal is being associated with masculinity, which we'll get to later in this video. But in the end, the individual metallization or cultivation of the body doesn't have any real power politically. It's simply a spectacle, a brute show of force that gives individual citizens the illusion of power, the illusion that they are in control, while they are actually serving the interests of the ruling class.
I produced a practical program worked out in office to reconstruct industry and also to give to our people useful work on useful schemes until they could be reabsorbed.
Before we get into Mishima himself, I would like to talk a little bit about how the body cult was not unique to explicitly fascist nations. The fascist movement and the body cult in Britain is the perfect example of how far-right extremism flourishes in the democratic world as well. In 1932, Oswald Mosley founded the British Union of Fascists, the BUF, which was an active political party up until the start of the Second World War. Now, if you guys have been taking notes, I mentioned at the beginning of the video that fascism espouses a populist idea that exploits the discontent of the masses to push a reactionary agenda. And this party arose out of Britain's economic devastation following the First World War. It advertised itself as a solution to the poverty caused by this war. And from 1933 to 1934, the party launched a campaign titled Hurry for the Black Shirts. Members of the BUF were nicknamed Black Shirts because of their uniforms in the Daily Mail, which was and still is one of the most popular British papers. According to Julie Gottlieb, the paper depicted, quote, black shirts engaging in acts of controlled physical exertion such as fencing, jiu-jitsu, motorcycling, and drilling, expressing satisfaction, pride, and ease in both facial expression and posture at being part of a group of uniformed bodies, marching, dining, and living together on the basis of a shared political commitment. They combined their reverence for the physically fit body to a classical idea of fitness that showed the strength of a mythologized national past. To the BUF, physical fitness was as important as political experience when it came to party membership, because a fascist body was a weapon in and of itself. Gottlieb continues by explaining how the Black Shirts used British sporting culture to push this narrative, hosting theatrical spectacles of physical fitness in sports arenas. If you've ever been to a sports event, I'm sure you've experienced the euphoric emotions of being surrounded by like-minded individuals, cheering for the same team, club, or nation. Group chants, group dress, and an overall community is fostered in the bleachers. The sports arena is a thrilling environment, a place where you renounce your individuality in a sea of groupthink voluntarily. Your feelings are going to be naturally intensified when there are people around you that share those same emotions. Mosley's choice to host his rallies in sports arenas was no coincidence, because not only does fascism encourage groupthink, but it also relies on spectacles to form a national consciousness and give citizens the illusion of power. Displays of strength and power are attractive and can legitimize the grip of the state on the masses who believe it's acting in their favor. I chose to talk about Britain in this video instead of the obvious fascist nations because I want to stress that the free world was and still is equally as capable of giving power to fascism. So, watch the kind of media that you consume. Unfortunately, we aren't taught enough about the Japanese Empire in the Second World War because Japanese ultra-nationalism isn't regarded as a serious issue. Despite the fact that they killed tens of millions of people, these atrocities have been watered down, considered less important, and even outright denied by governments and the media. This is partly because the Japanese Imperial Army enacted most of their war crimes on their Asian colonial subjects, and Eurocentric historians tend to give less attention to non-white victims of war. Furthermore, Japan's effective soft power diplomacy has whitewashed its brutal legacy and contributed to this lack of accountability regarding their war crimes and their imperial past. In the 1930s and 40s, Japan had cultivated a collective consciousness of fear in their country, embroiling their population into a full-scale imperialist war. Japan saw themselves as the leaders of Asia, creating colonies in neighboring countries and exploiting their resources and labor for this mythologized apocalyptic war with the West. Traditional samurai values of honor, loyalty, and militarism were promoted, and Japan-style fascism was used to fight for global dominance. In the last stretch of the Second World War, as the empire became increasingly desperate for a military victory, a young Yukio Mishima was sent a draft letter to serve his country, but he was deemed physically unfit to do so. Since he was born into a samurai lineage which honored physical strength, this was an emasculating moment in his life, with some scholars even going to say that Mishima developed an obsessive relationship with his body due to this very fact, this emasculating moment.
The grand climax of 3.5 years of grueling fighting is reached as members of America's historic 7th Regiment of the 1st Cavalry Division enter Tokyo.
The surrender of the Japanese Empire in 1945 deeply impacted Mishima's values and politics.
終戦の時私は終戦の消息を親戚のうちで聞きました。私は不思議な感動を通り越したような空白感しかありませんでした。ちょうど40年、41歳の私はちょうど20歳の時に迎えた終戦を自分の人生の目処として
The forced westernization of his country during U.S. occupation pushed him further and further right. While the U.S. occupation was objectively awful, suppressing labor movements throughout the country and turning it into what is now essentially a U.S. client state, Mishima's intentions were not anti-imperialist. He was a reactionary who desired a return to a mythologized and militaristic traditional Japan. Despite this, he remains a venerated author in Japanese culture, the literary community, and apparently with PewDiePie. It's important to note that Mishima was a deeply lonely and insecure individual. In his 1949 book, Confessions of a Mask, Mishima writes about the struggles of being a closeted gay man, and it is widely considered among scholars to be a semi-biographical story, even though it is fiction. There is a moment in this novel in which the protagonist attempts to reverse his homosexuality by sleeping with another woman. And he thus learns that his desire cannot be disciplined like the body can. In his disassociation, he tells himself, quote,
"You're not human. You're a being who is incapable of social intercourse. You're nothing but a creature, non-human, and somehow strangely pathetic."
This story reveals how Mishima felt alienated from the ideals of his society, but this tragic part of his life was never resolved due to the misdirection of his anger. Instead of coming to terms with his alienation in a healthy manner, body aesthetics pushed him further into an ultra-nationalist rabbit hole. In 1968, 2 decades after Confessions of a Mask, Mishima published the essay Sun and Steel, which is the piece that inspired PewDiePie to make his video. In this essay, he condemns his own hibernation and what he perceives as the self-isolation of intellectuals who devote all of their time to philosophizing without taking any actual action. Mishima lets go of this past by embracing sun and steel, by going outside and using these steel gym weights to strengthen his physique. Now don't get me wrong, it was a compelling and beautifully written piece. While I was reading it for this video, I found myself resonating with many of his words. Despite his right-wing political inclinations, the text felt oddly proletarian with its words on alienation and condemnation of bourgeois intellectualism. However, Mishima was a fervent anti-Marxist and believed that the westernization of his country was the root of Japan's problems. He was more preoccupied with the aesthetics of imperial Japan, militarism, and nationalism, channeling his energy into the cultivation of the body for the state.
I don't like the Japanese culture is represented only by the flower arrangement or such a sort of peace-loving culture. I think we still have a very strong warrior's mind. I particularly liked kendo from the sense of beauty, but gradually I found out the traditional value of the kendo. And in the samurai tradition, the sense of beauty was always connected with death.
Mishima believed that the physical body was indicative of one's morality. To him, an unfit individual represented passivity and feebleness. He states, quote,
"Feeble emotions, it seemed to me, corresponded to flaccid muscles, sentimentality to a sagging stomach, and overimpressionability to an oversensitive white skin. Bulging muscles, a taut stomach, and a tough skin, I reasoned, would correspond respectively to an intrepid fighting spirit, the power of dispassionate intellectual judgment, and a robust disposition."
Now, considering his experience being deemed physically unfit to serve in the Second World War, and his period of alienation expressed in Confessions of a Mask, these conclusions can be seen as a rejection of his old hibernation. Mishima ended up internalizing his alienation and embraced an ideology that went against his own identity. But if you were just watching a PewDiePie video, you wouldn't have this context, would you? At face value, this book can be interpreted as a polemic on physical discipline, a motivational self-help book that encourages its readers to get out and hit the gym, which is a message I would agree with. Without any historical or biographical context, I can see why this work is so compelling with impressionable young men. However, Mishima masks a reactionary agenda amid his flowery words.
"I cherished a romantic impulse toward death, yet at the same time I required a strictly classical body as its vehicle. A peculiar sense of destiny made me believe that the reason why my romantic impulse toward death had remained unfulfilled in reality was the immensely simple fact that I lacked the necessary physical qualifications."
You see, he didn't cultivate his body for the sake of life. Instead, he cultivated his body for the sake of death. And this is where Sun and Steel reveals itself as a manifesto on militarism and self-sacrifice for the state. You see, the traditionalist ethos of Japanese fascism glorifies ritualistic or seppuku, which is what Mishima is advocating for in this passage. This traditional samurai practice saw revival during the Second World War, in which soldiers would commit suicide to restore honors for themselves, their families, or the empire. This form of sacrificial, militant masculinity is ideal in fascism because it means that you would sacrifice yourself for the Führer, emperor, or dictatorial name of your choice. In May of 1937, on the eve of their invasion of China and the start of the Second Sino-Japanese War, Japan's Ministry of Education incorporated military training into physical education curricula in school. They learned how to throw hand grenades and had bayonet drills. In December of 1937, after their official entrance into the war, the ministry redefined the aim of public sports educations to serve the purpose of national strengthening instead of individual fitness. Health became politicized, because as I said earlier, fascism requires youth and vitality not only for military victory, but to feed the narrative that the nation has the physical right to conquer, that they are physically superior to the people that they seek to exploit. This physical education also served the purpose of creating a collective Japanese spirit. My claim that Mishima's ideology is a body cult can further be supported by this veneration for the collective.
Only through the group, I realized, through sharing the suffering of the group, could the body reach that height of existence that the individual alone could never attain. And for the body to reach that level, at which the divine might be glimpsed, a dissolution of individuality was necessary. The tragic quality of the group was also necessary, the quality that constantly raised the group out of the abandon and torpor into which it was prone to lapse, leading to an ever-mounting shared suffering and so to death, which was the ultimate suffering. The group must be open to death, which meant, of course, that it must be a community of warriors.
Like how cults promote a collective spirit for the sake of the individual, Mishima uses bodybuilding to strip himself and his comrades of their individuality for the sake of the emperor. This paragraph also felt oddly proletarian to me. However, unlike Marx's conceptions of collectivity, which are promoted for the sake of the collective themselves, Mishima sacrifices his individual self for the sake of the emperor/nation-state. Similarly to how he promotes health for the sake of death, he promotes collectivity for the sake of an individual. Are we starting to see how reactionary movements disguise themselves as progressive? This is because, like I said earlier, aesthetics can be used in malicious ways to promote an illusion of collectivity, an illusion of health, and an illusion of progress that the masses so desperately desire.
As the relentless pressure of the steel progressively stripped my muscles of their unusualness and individuality, which were a product of degeneration, and as they gradually developed, they should, I reasoned, begin to assume a universal aspect, until finally they reached a point where they conformed to a general pattern in which individual differences ceased to exist. The universality thus attained would suffer no private corrosion, no betrayal. That was the most desirable trait in my eyes.
Considering his anti-Marxism, he doesn't critique individualism because of its role in upholding capitalism. Instead, he maintains the fascistic desire for a homogenized society. Those who see Sun and Steel as an inspirational self-help book are either deeply uninformed, insecure, or miss the point entirely. In reality, it is a pretty sad depiction of Mishima's internal battle with his own feelings of alienation and repressed homosexuality. Sun and Steel reveals how the aesthetics of Japanese ultra-nationalism and fascism in general draws in people who feel different, with the promise of alleviating said differences. Now, this is not to excuse Mishima for his reactionary politics or influence in pushing people to the far right, but it shows how reactionary movements prey on the insecurities created by capitalism and exploit their discontent. Sun and Steel is not a wellness book. It is best used as a historical source, an example of how capitalist alienation can draw people away from their source of exploitation and towards movements that will go against their very own identity. On November 1970, Mishima led a private ultranationalist militia in an attempted coup d'etat on a military base in Tokyo. They tied up the military commander to a chair and delivered a speech to the soldiers, attempting to incite a reactionary coup that would restore the power of the emperor that was taken from US occupation. After chanting "Long live the emperor" 3 times, Mishima took his own life. His final act was a realization of his goals in Sun and Steel, and was actually foreshadowed in one of his last published stories, The Runaway Horse. This is a literary retelling and amalgamation of several attempted right-wing coups d'etats in Japanese history. Like Mishima, the individuals behind these coups also desired national militarization and a radical movement that would rid their country of foreign influence. This story follows Isao Linuma and his plot to overthrow the Zaibatsu, which was a business conglomerate that dominated Japan. Linuma saw the Zaibatsu as an enemy not because it exploited its workers, but because they posed a threat to the power of the emperor. Throughout the story, he condemns Japan's capitalism not for the system itself, but for the conglomerate's lack of a national allegiance. To Mishima and the protagonist, Japan is a sacred land that is being corrupted by foreign influence, and thus he commits a romanticized ritual.
それにつけて思い出しますのは、18世紀頃に書かれた「葉隠れ」という本で、武士道とは死ぬことと見つけたりというんで有名になった本ですが、この時代もやっぱり今と似ていた。でもう戦国の夢は覚めて、今現代の死は病気にしろあるいは交通事故にしろ、何らのドラマがない、英雄的な死というものもない時代に我々生きております。
Mishima's final act, the cultivation of a beautiful body for the sake of a beautiful death, is a perfect example of Walter Benjamin's thesis on the fascist use of aesthetics. And as much as I love to hate on him, Mishima's story is kind of sad. He was born into an environment that promoted reactionary beliefs that clashed with his own repressed desires. But instead of coming to terms with these desires, he ends up sacrificing himself for a mythologized national identity, an act that ended up having no political power. The aesthetic mysticism of the Japanese Empire appealed to Mishima, who in turn created a whole new aesthetic morality surrounding the body through his writing. The role of steel in cultivating the body for Mishima, Mosley, and Marinetti may seem different, but they are all equally as performative. Mishima cultivates his body as a work of art, and his language regarding his journey is theatrical and flowery. There's a compelling mysticism in his story that draws his readers in. He draws upon a mystic and glorious past of Japan, a narrative that was promoted during the imperial period to foster a sense of nationalism. Mishima is constantly performing, whether it be through his characters, his physical self-discipline, or his planning of a beautiful death. As we discussed earlier, fascism allows for the expression of resent through aesthetic spectacles, giving people the illusion of power. However, Mishima's final act was just that, a spectacle that despite its reality has become fictionalized through his writings. Now I'll end this video by saying that physical fitness is important, and fitness influencers have done a great deal in making health accessible. But working out is not praxis. And if you ever come across someone who is trying to mysticize athleticism, someone who speaks of a mythologized past which you should fight for in your workout routines, they might be trying to sell you fascism. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. As always, thank you to all my patrons who make this content possible. Don't forget to leave a like on this video and subscribe if you want to see more content from me. And yeah, that's it. Have a great rest of your day. Bye guys!